All right, today we're going to be talking about events that are occurring within the nation of Russia. So, Russia itself is not going to finish the war with the other allied powers. In fact, they're going to have an entire civil war within their own nation that's going to pull them out of the war before it ends. That would be the Russian Revolution, or what some people refer to as the October Revolution. One of them, at least. Now, some of the main players that we need to talk about is going to be Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin was a revolutionary in that he supported and kind of evoked some of the communist ideas that Karl Marx had written about. He was the leader of the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were kind of the more hardcore revolutionaries within Russia. There's another group called the Mensheviks, which are much more moderate in that they want workers' rights and a little bit more closer to socialism, where the Bolsheviks were the smaller, more hardcore Marxist revolutionaries. And again, the goal for them is to overthrow the Tsar, get rid of the Tsar, overthrow the government, and establish a communist form of government, as that may seem. Now, the problem in Russia is that they were they were underdeveloped, and a lot of the workers were not treated right. And if you're looking at the long line of Russian history, the Russian government had only outlawed the use of serfs, or essentially kind of legal slave labor, within the last 100 years. Every other nation had done it hundreds of years ago, and Russia itself was just so backwards in a way. A lot of these workers were upset because they didn't have the same kind of rights that the other European nations had. So they're trying to follow the same development as like Russia, or as Great Britain and France and places like that. But they're like 50 to 100 years behind them. Now, Tsar Nicholas had hoped that this war would bring people together, kind of create this patriotism. But realistically, once the war started, Russia was so behind and they were so weak in comparison to the opponents that it did increase the patriotism, but it also really highlighted the failures that Tsar Nicholas had in kind of deciding to go to war. Basically, this war was not so much about winning because it was right. It was about trying to hold this shamble nation together and try to kind of win points, like political points, for his against his opponents. So the reason why Russia wasn't ready for the war, their factories were behind, supplies were, they didn't have enough supplies to support the war effort. They hadn't started production until it was really too late. They didn't have the transportation system set up, so the railways were not developed and they couldn't extend to the farther reaching cities, places like Kiev, what would become Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow. They weren't as connected and able to produce goods and then move them to these major cities to distribute. There's also the issue of modern equipment. They didn't have the kind of machine guns or planes or tanks that would later develop. They didn't have those technologies. What they had was repeater rifles and enough technology to get helmets. So they were fighting basically behind. They are one of the first ones to jump in the war, and they are so behind in technological advancement, in their ability to produce these military goods, and basically just behind in organization, that it was basically they were set up for failure. They also didn't have the kind of leadership set up to sustain a long war. Right? They're kind of having very ineffective leaders running major campaigns that were complete failures, and especially in the public eye, that is a bad thing. Now, at one point, the military is losing. So they're a year into the war, and it's the public perception of the war is already not positive. They're already kind of very skeptical about Russia's involvement. So Nicholas decides that, all right, if I'm going to be seen as a patriotic person, if I'm going to lead Russia the way I want it, I'm going to do it myself. So he goes to the front lines to lead the military campaign in World War I. Well, that's great, but it kind of gives this ultimatum where if Russia fails, it's on Nicholas. It's not on somebody else. He can't blame anybody else because he's the one organizing the military. Well, he goes to the front lines, and he's going to leave his wife essentially in charge, or she's kind of running the city in a way. Now, some of the issues with the conditions here, food is going to be scarce. There's going to be a couple of really harsh winters that are going on. There's not going to be the kind of production that's needed. And peasants or the poor people are very desperate. Anytime food goes down, the people that are going to go without are the people without money. That would be the poor. And so Serena Alexandra, his wife, is going to take charge. Now, she's not very popular as well. And it's going to get even worse because she's going to take a political advisor named Grigory Rasputin as kind of the main person giving her political advice. Now, Rasputin was considered kind of this magic healer guy. And the whole story behind him is that he was able to cure their son Alexander, who had hemophilia. Well, the thing is, realistically, you can't cure hemophilia. What had happened was or at least what people speculate, is that Rasputin had told him to stop taking what would be kind of Advil back then, which was a blood thinner. And a blood thinner to a hemophiliac is terrible. So what they saw was that Alexander, the son, was having less bleeding under the skin, less bruising, which made them think that he was kind of cured or on his way to be cured. So Alexandria, Serena, was thought of him as kind of this magic healer. Obviously, he did the waving his hands around, so it looked like he was doing something spectacular. Now, the real issue with Rasputin was that he was this corrupt and immoral person. There's a bunch of rumors that went around that with Nicholas II gone to the front lines, that Alexandria, the Serena, and Rasputin were kind of canoodling around having their own little affair because the husband was gone. So that's the public perception, that this magic man is giving political advice. He's having an affair with the Serena, and she's just listening to whatever he says when he's not a political person. He's not part of the family. The other thing is that there's going to be a plot to kill Rasputin because he's seen as kind of a threat to the nation. So what there's going to happen is these nobles, these higher ups, these effectively political actors are going to come and invite Rasputin in to drink. And what they've done is they've put so much poison into his wine that it could kill 3 men. Well, what he does is they're having a great time. He starts drinking and nothing happens. Well, the poison hasn't worked. So one of them sneaks upstairs and runs back down and shoots Rasputin in the chest 3 times. He then gets up, runs outside, and they chase after him. They shoot him a couple more times in the back. They then take his body and roll him up in a carpet and then dump him into the nearest river. Well, when they find the body the next day, it looks like Rasputin was able to wiggle himself out of the carpet out at least his waist before he died of hypothermia. That's why this kind of myth happened of Rasputin being this unkillable magic man. Essentially, he had lived through 3 times the amount of poison. I believe it was somewhere between 4 and 6 gunshots to the chest. And the thing that kills him is drowning, or essentially drowning while being hypothermic, right? Having hypothermia happen to him. And even then, he almost survived if he could have gotten out. But that's a lot of that is mythicized or kind of pumped up to make him seem like this crazy character. Still interesting nonetheless. Now, talking about the revolution, there is going to be a march on Petrograd, which is kind of where the governmental body is, the Duma. Now, the body is going to support these revolutionaries. They want to kick out Nicholas II because they see him as very ineffective and still not doing what's necessary to help the people. So the Duma is going to essentially force Nicholas II to abdicate. These revolutionaries are going to be kind of a part of the Duma and kind of oust him. This is their first step to getting rid of the old way of life. So once Tsar Nicholas has been kicked out, they're going to put Alexander Kerensky in charge. He is a he is a lawyer that had fought for the Tsar and also the revolutionaries. He had represented both. So Alexander Kerensky was seen as this kind of intermediary. Now, Kerensky's idea was that instead of going away from the Tsar into this communist way of government, this kind of socialism kind of government, that instead they would move more towards a republic, try to give the people more say in the government and things like that, which seems great to us, but was incredibly unpopular back then because that didn't favor or that didn't show any direction towards socialism or towards a communist version of government. So he was basically completely ignored. Now the Bolsheviks are seeing the government change, the people kind of rising up, and that's going to bolster their revolution. They've gotten rid of the first government that they don't like, and now what they want to do is move their leadership into power. So while Kerensky is fighting, right, he is now having to take on the role of leader of the Central Power, or he's having to lead the Russian army against the Central Powers. The army was weak, it was ineffective, and on top of that, he has a last-ditch effort where he is going to try to take out or make a major attack against the Russian army or the German army. This is what we call the Kerensky Offensive. So he threw the biggest, largest army at the Germans. The only problem was that the Germans were ready. So essentially, he threw all of his soldiers in to be slaughtered. This is going to basically get rid of Kerensky's this kind of idea that he might be an effective leader or he might be leading them in the right direction. It took all of the confidence away from the people for Kerensky. And shortly after that, the Red Guard is going to attack Kerensky's government, essentially the Bolsheviks' military branch, right? The Red Guard. So Kerensky's going to see the writing on the wall. He can either try to fight against the Red Guard, the people rising up, and get killed, or he can just let them go. So what he does is he gives up power, he escapes to France, and he dies in France. Lenin is going to step up and become the leader. He is now the leader of the communist Russia, essentially, right? He is the de facto leader. He's going to get rid of private ownership of anything, and he's going to redistribute the land for farming purposes to all of the peasants. Again, every communist idea here. Lenin's big promise is that he's going to end involvement in the war. He doesn't see this as productive. The Russian people don't see this as productive. So he sends a man named Leon Trotsky to negotiate with the Central Powers. Leon Trotsky was another one of the revolutionary speakers, and along the lines of Leon Trotsky is Joseph Stalin, who are both big political kind of these orators. They're the ones that are sharing these communist ideas and trying to kind of rev up the people to rise up against the powers. Leon Trotsky is going to be one of the biggest kind of actors. He's one of the most recognized outside of Lenin. Now, when they're negotiating, Russia didn't have much to stand on. They had lost so many fights, and the Germans basically realized that if they wanted to, they could take Russia entirely within a couple of months. So Leon Trotsky had to give up so much of their land. Wide swaths of things like Poland were just shed. And this was all just to make sure that Russia could stay on its own, right? To preserve Russia, they had to give up so much, which is going to be very kind of hard to swallow for the Russian people. But if it means that they can have their revolution in peace, that's what they were going to do. Now, we kind of say that ironically because the revolution is going to end up being bloodier than the war was, right? They're going to lose more people in this communist uprising than they would have if they just stayed in the war. Because by the time that the Russians decide to leave the war, it's less than 2 years away from the end. I believe it's 1 year and a month away from ending. And by the end of the war, there wasn't really that much fighting going on the Eastern Front. So all they had to do was hold the lines. Germany was about to give up. Austria-Hungary was done. The Ottoman Empire was basically useless by the end of the war. So there's going to be this rise up. There's this civil war that breaks out between the Reds and the Whites. If you look at this picture, that's how they're going to be presented. The Reds, the Red Army, is going to be the communists. The Whites are going to be basically pro-Tsar people that favored the way that the system used to be. This is going to be wealthy Russians, the people at the top, right? People that communists typically don't like. Army leaders, people that liked the Tsar at the time. Now, here's the thing is France and the United States are going to support the White Army because they see communism as a threat. And this is actually going to start a movement within both of those countries against forms of communism. This is the first time that a country has openly declared that they are supporting communism. And the idea is if one country takes hold other countries will fall to it as well, right? That idea of communism spreading is going to infect all of the other countries, right? That's the fear, the first Red Scare, if you want to talk about that. So essentially, with every civil war, there's a huge loss of life. The problem was that the country was already underproducing food and they weren't very advanced. So what the Civil War ends up becoming is just this massive loss of life. People starving to death because no one's producing enough goods, people killing their brothers, right? Things like that. Eventually, in the 20s, the Bolsheviks are going to triumph. Again, the end of the war is 1918. This war, this civil war, is going to continue on for 2 years past when World War I happens. So if they had just waited to the end of the fight, they could have kept their land and maybe preserved some semblance of a nation. Who knows? Now there's going to be a new economic policy that's going to permit some capitalistic activity within Russia. They're basically realizing very early on that they're not able to produce the goods that they need. They have so many people that they're going to have to start trading, that they're going to have to start selling off some of their produced goods to make money. Because being a capitalist country is great, but you're essentially isolating yourself from any other trade, right? Because the capitalist countries aren't going to do anything with you. So they're having to essentially move away from that communist idea back to some form of capitalism. And there's going to be the establishment of the Soviet Union moving forward. The economy is going to improve once they start introducing some of these capitalist ideas. There's going to be this reunification with lands that they had previously owned. Essentially, after the war ends, there's kind of this kind of grabbing back of that territory, like I had talked about with Poland. Some of those lands are going to come back under Russian ownership. Well, kind of trying to rebrand in a way, the Russian Empire is going to switch from being solely focused on expanding and more so about expanding the idea of communism or socialism. So they change from being the Russian Empire or the Tsardom of Russia and turn into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, what we would refer to as the Soviet Union. Now, once Lenin dies, he ends up having a stroke that kills him. He dies, and there's this kind of clamor on who should be the next in charge. There's basically this discussion on whether it should be Joseph Stalin or Leon Trotsky, both of these two big members. Both now the big thing is Leon Trotsky was a big orator. He was a big speaker. Now Joseph Stalin was much more about writing. He would write things and he would appear and he had this kind of terrifying presence. Well, in the end of it, Joseph Stalin is going to end up kind of forcing Leon Trotsky to leave the country out of fear of being assassinated. And that's going to make Joseph Stalin the de facto leader, essentially. Trotsky ends up leaving for his life, and Stalin's the only political leader left around. So he becomes the dictator of the USSR.